Hello everyone and welcome to my channel, and welcome if you are new here. I'm Andrea M and this is Unsolved Down Under. And we're also back to our Real Crime and Coffee Tuesdays because it is freezing here in Australia at the moment, hence the beanie and the scarf worn indoors. It's absolutely bleak and cold, just how I like it. Not so much that because I really need my coffee. So grab yourself a coffee or a cool drink no matter where you're watching from. Grab a snack. Today's video is about two very courageous women in recent Australian history who put themselves out there at great personal risk to themselves. And it is, both of their cases remain technically unsolved to this very day. And I really don't want these ladies to be forgotten, particularly the first story that I'll be presenting to you today. And I actually remember her. I remember being a young kid and seeing her on the television, and I just thought she was a beautiful lady. She had these big blue eyes, gorgeous, pretty woman, but I didn't know at the time what she was talking about or the danger that she was in. But I never forgot her, and this is my chance to make sure that nobody else forgets her either. And the second lady today also is very worthwhile remembering because of what she did to maintain heritage listed premises in Sydney from being taken over by pretty much the crime bosses that were active at that time. So we're going to just jump on into today's stories. It's Saturday the 27th of June 1981, and 22-year-old drug dealer and standover man Warren Frenchie Lanfranchi was shot dead by New South Wales Detective Roger Rogerson in Dangar Place in Chippendale. Lanfranchi was a known associate of Neddy Smith and Abbo Henry, and they were two other standover men who were on Roger Rogerson's payroll back then in the 1980s. And you will have heard me mention Roger Rogerson before. So this is pretty much the story of what took Roger Rogerson down as Australia's most dirty and corrupt police officer. At first, it seemed a case of the police shooting a suspect in a case of self-defence. But what later was revealed by Warren Lanfranchi's girlfriend, Sallie Huckstepp, would lead to the biggest revelation in police corruption ever in Australian history. It was also what would lead to the 31-year-old mother of one's untimely demise in 1986 in Sydney's Hyde Park, where a jogger would make the horrific discovery of Sally Ann's body floating in the pond in February. But before we look into the presumed murdered women, if you enjoy real crime, disasters, the paranormal, urban legends, the missing and unsolved cases, then you have come to the right channel, because that's all that we do here. We also have a little coffee. And if this is of interest to you, I'd like to ask you to please consider subscribing to my channel and turning on all notifications so that you never miss a video. Smash the like button, share to your socials, and drop a respectful comment or two in the comment section below. It's free to do and you'd be helping me out a ton. With that being said, let's begin. Sally Ann Huckstepp, or as she was known before she was married, Sally Ann Crivershow, was born on the 12th of December 1954. She was an Australian writer, she was a sex worker, and she was a whistleblower who was the victim of a homicide. She came to attention in 1981 for speaking out about police corruption in Sydney. Huckstepp's murder still to this day remains unsolved. As we just covered briefly, Huckstepp was born as Sally Ann Crivershow into a middle-class Jewish family and attended Dover Heights High School and Maria College in Sydney. She left school at the age of 17 and married Brian Huckstepp. After travelling to Kalgoorlie, Western Australia, her husband trafficked her into prostitution to help support his heroin addiction. So Sally Ann was actually known as quite a rebellious teenager, and she got married at 17, but with the podcasts and the true crime documentaries about Sally that I watched to prepare for this video, she actually left home at the age of 13, and she was on the streets pretty much ever since then. But I just think this is so horrible that she has taken a chance on a man and he's married her, and then he has pimped her out to be a prostitute to support his heroin addiction. And he continued to do that, and Sally Ann eventually developed a heroin habit of her own. As you can imagine, she probably would, to try and cope with what he was putting her through, putting her on the streets to fund his addiction. It's these things, like, we cover these sort of topics a lot, but it never ceases to disgust me at the vile things that men will do to women. Not all men, we know there's some good ones out there, but there's been some terrible ones as well. So you might as well just say that Sally Ann just never had a chance. She eventually divorced Huckstepp, and in 1981 she began a relationship with Warren Lanfranchi. Lanfranchi was a heroin dealer and standover man who worked with Arthur Nettie Smith. In June 1981, Lanfranchi allegedly robbed a Sydney heroin dealer and later fired shots at a young policeman. In Nettie, The Life and Crimes of Arthur Stanley Smith, Smith claims that Lanfranchi asked him to negotiate a payment with then Detective Sergeant Roger Rogerson to escape being charged with the shooting. Smith claims that Rogerson had instructed him to drive Lanfranchi to a meeting with him and to disarm him in the car. Rogerson took 18 police officers with him to the meeting. He claims that he was attempting to arrest Lanfranchi on a suspicion of 5 bank robberies. At the meeting in Dangar Place, Chippendale, Rogerson shot and killed Lanfranchi. During the inquest into Lanfranchi's death, Rogerson claimed self-defence. He was supported at the inquest by Smith and the other police officers who were called as witnesses. But as you will see in this snippet of an interview that the whistleblower Sally Ann Huckstepp had with Ray Martin in 1991, that was not actually the case. So take a look.
Because we were terrified. We thought he'd kill us. Because we were terrified. Detective Rogerson has a reputation as being a killer. In fact, Warren was so terrified, he went and bought himself a gun and used to sleep with it next to the bed because we were terrified that Rogerson was going to find out where we were and come in and kill us both in our bed.
The inquest found that on the balance of probabilities, Rogerson had been trying to arrest Lanfranchi, but refused to find he had acted in self-defence. The matter went to the Supreme Court and was the subject of investigations by the New South Wales Ombudsman of Internal Affairs. No action was brought against Rogerson at this time, and he was exonerated and commended for bravery. This is another one of those cases where I have absolutely no words for this man. He was New South Wales's top cop, but he was crooked as a dog's hind leg. He was extremely corrupt. He was a murderer. He was a drug dealer. Fortunately, he's in prison for the rest of his life, never to be released. So now we get into Sally's next actions involving the death of her boyfriend, Warren Lanfranchi. On the 15th of July 1981, Huckstepp, accompanied by her father Jack Crivershow and a legal aid solicitor, went to the New South Wales Police Headquarters in College Street, Darlinghurst, where she met with Detective Inspector Ralph and Detective Reith of the New South Wales Police Internal Affairs Branch. She made the following statement, which eventually helped lead to the Independent Commission Against Corruption and the Wood Royal Commission. Sally would go on to say, "I will tell you everything. I have the following criminal record. I have 31 convictions for prostitution. I have a conspiracy to defraud conviction, which occurred shortly after I left Harry Bailey's tender care at Chelmsford. I then had 2 further marijuana convictions, a heroin conviction when I was loaded up by detectives Peter and Tomich at the Lido Bar. I have a further use charge in which detectives Peter George and Jungblatt were both involved." So I've actually not come across their names in any of the other research, but I would say that these were other corrupt police officers who would have been on Roger Rogerson's payroll. They would have been within his inner circle. In both the latter offences, significant sums of money were paid to the police to affect the outcome. While operating as a prostitute, Sallie would go on to say, "I made regular payments to the members of the Vice Squad for over 10 years. I have been involved in a number of transactions which I referred to in my statement, which have involved substantial payment to members of the Drug Squad and other detectives relating to drug matters. I believe that the New South Wales Drug Squad and the Armed Hold-Up Squad are both totally corrupt and that they feed on the very activities of which they are supposed to be trying to stop." Huckstepp also went to the media and gave extensive interviews, claiming that Rogerson had murdered Lanfranchi and stolen $10,000 Lanfranchi was carrying to pay Rogerson with. She also claimed that Nettie Smith had lied to the inquest and was involved in a conspiracy with Rogerson. Rogerson maintained his innocence. In Nettie, The Life and Crimes of Arthur Stanley Smith, Smith wrote that Lanfranchi was attempting to bribe Rogerson. "I was the person who took Warren to his fatal meeting. There was an inquest and both sides threw plenty of shit at one another. I was right in the middle of it all. I could do nothing to bring Warren back to life. So I did the best I could. I know Warren's family suffered deeply, but I cannot do anything about it." He goes on to claim that as a result of his testimony at the inquest, Rogerson and the other corrupt police officers gave him a green light to commit crime without fear of prosecution. And you will find that this is important for later. Huckstepp continued lobbying the media. A documentary made about her life was made, and she began writing articles for a monthly magazine. So Sallie actually became a journalist in her own right. For a while there, she was kind of trying to clean up her act, and I think at this time she was trying to stay within the public eye as much as she could, because Sally Ann went into this with her eyes open. She knew that if she outed Rogerson, she was probably going to die. She was probably going to be marked for a hit because she had stood up against the man who had killed her boyfriend and was putting the lives of everybody, the police officers who weren't corrupt, the public at large in general. He was putting so many people's lives in danger with his corrupt dealings, and that was what Sallie wanted to stop. And she went on TV and she told Ray Martin everything in the interview. She, like we just said, she went on to write a lot of stories in magazines. She testified at the inquiries, and she had effectively put a target on herself, and she knew it. She knew that the minute she was out of the public eye, that's when they would come for her. So while she did try and clean up her act for a little while there, she did continue using heroin. And in 1985, her then partner, David Kelleher, was arrested on charges of importing heroin worth more than $2 million. With Kelleher remanded into custody, Huckstepp began a relationship with a federal police officer, Peter Parker Smith, and, Peter Parker, but he's Peter Parker Smith, and no, he's not Spider-Man. Just gonna get that out there. So Huckstepp visited Kelleher regularly in prison, telling him she was attempting to get information from Constable Smith, which could be useful in his trial. In Catch and Kill Your Own, Nettie Smith claims that Huckstepp was trying to help Kelleher by making taped recordings of her conversations with Constable Smith. So for a while there, Sally Ann's going about her business, she's living her life, and she's just, she's still trying to stop this corruption within the ranks of the police department, even though she was still using heroin herself. She may have even been dealing. I couldn't really find if she was actually dealing herself, but it's pretty self-evident that the men that she was with were dealers, and that would have been how they would have made a lot of money back then. But it did eventually lead to her untimely demise, and we're going to cover that now. This all leads up to the evening of the 6th of February 1986, when Sally Ann received a phone call in her Edgecliff apartment. She rushed out, telling Gwen Beecroft, an acquaintance with whom she stayed at the time, she'd be back in a few minutes. The following morning, a man walking his dog found her body in Busby Pond, a lake in Centennial Park, New South Wales. Huckstepp's murder resulted in one of the longest running inquests of its kind in Australian history. It began in 1987 and lasted until 1991, though it only sat for a total of 19 days in that time. It was alleged at the inquest that Huckstepp had gone to meet an unknown drug dealer to obtain a fresh supply of heroin and was then lured to Busby's Pond, a remote area of the park. She was then strangled and drowned. Peter Smith, the federal policeman with whom she was having an affair at the time, testified that she had told him she was frightened that Nettie Smith and Roger Rogerson, or David Kelleher, who was in prison at the time, may try to murder her. He later told the Administrative Appeals Tribunal that Huckstepp's death was a traumatic event for him. The coroner found that the evidence was insufficient to recommend charges and made a finding that Huckstepp had been murdered by a person or persons unknown. Prior to the inquest, Nettie Smith was interviewed 4 times by 4 separate teams of detectives. He claims that he was at home with his wife the night that Huckstepp was murdered. However, he was secretly recorded confessing to a cellmate at Long Bay Correctional Centre that he was recorded saying he had attacked Huckstepp from behind, punched her, grabbed her by the throat, lifted her off the ground and then strangled her for about 6 minutes. Smith then claimed he had dragged her into the pond and stood on her back to keep her head submerged for a few more minutes. He was also recorded saying, "Strangling somebody is the hardest thing in the world." And these are his words, so please don't come for me. I am just as disgusted by this as the rest of you. He went on to say it was also the most satisfying thing he ever did in his life. Yeah, this guy is a piece of work. I would like to say what I really think, but I'd get kicked off YouTube. But I'm sure you guys can all guess what I'm really thinking, and you probably are too. Smith later dismissed his confession as lies, saying he knew he was being taped and wanted the publicity for his new book, Catch and Kill Your Own. He is also alleged to have confessed to his publisher. Smith was subsequently charged in September 1996 with Huckstepp's murder and was committed to stand trial, but was acquitted in 1999 due to lack of evidence. In an interview with writer John Dale, Smith claimed that Huckstepp was murdered because she kept bugging Rogerson, ringing him up and leaving messages that he was a dog. The reason they didn't bury her or dispose of her body was Roger wanted her left floating in the pond as a message. And here we go again, just another lovely, lovely man in the long and sordid history of police corruption in New South Wales. And yes, he is in prison and he is never going to be released, let me just say that. And that's a very good thing. I am going to do like a full video all about Roger Rogerson, and oh my God, it is going to curl your hair. This man, honestly, and he had started his career so promisingly as a hero policeman. And just at that time, the corruption, and I think just the power of being so corrupt and having all these people under you and afraid of you just got to his head. And he became this just absolute diabolical creature. I have no other way to describe this guy. Smith would also say the bloke who killed her has never been arrested and is not in jail. The courageous and unforgettable Sallie Ann Huckstepp is survived by her daughter Sasha, who was born in 1973 and is an actress and casting agent in Sydney. Sasha had a minor role as a nurse in the Australian miniseries Blue Murder, which featured a character played by Lonnie Carmen based on her mother. In 1991 and 1992, she appeared as Jade Williams in the British soap opera Families. Huckstepp was also the half-sister of Australian screenwriter and actor Matt Kay. And I would like, oh my God, oh the feels. When you watch Sallie Ann's interview, she was a prostitute. She was very much street smart, but I could see in that interview the sadness in her eyes and that she was already resigned to her fate. And there was something innocent about her as well, though. I mean, despite everything she was involved with, there was still an innocence about Sallie Ann. And yeah, before you finish this video, please take a moment to remember her. Go look at her picture. She's written a couple of books. Go look them up. Just please don't forget Sally Ann, because she was so courageous. Like, she knew she was going to die. She knew they were going to come for her. But she did it anyway to avenge the murder of Warren Lanfranchi and to stop them hurting other people in the future. And that needs to be celebrated. We don't want to dwell on the fact that she was a heroin addict and she was a prostitute. What we want to remember her for was her bravery and the fact that she was a really phenomenal mother. She was a great mother to her daughter, and my heart just goes out to her beautiful daughter, Sasha. I'm going to need a minute before I move on to the next case. Oh, wow. You don't think these cases are going to get to you when you're sitting here and you're reading them out, but these were real people. They existed. They had loved ones. They had fathers, mothers. They had children. And just remembering her. I just remember hearing her name in the news when I was small. And I remember, like I said before, seeing her on 60 Minutes with Ray Martin. And just how beautifully spoken and softly spoken and calm she was. And then watching it again for this video, it got me right in the feels, and she was so young. She didn't even get to see her daughter grow up and become this amazing woman that she's become. Now, going to move on to the second and right up until this very day, unsolved murder of activist and heiress Juanita Nilsson. Juanita Joan Nilsson, nee Smith, was born on the 22nd of April 1937 and disappeared on the 4th of July 1975. She was an Australian newspaper owner, publisher, journalist, model, urban conservationist and heiress. She disappeared after attending a meeting at the Carousel nightclub, also Les Girls, in King's Cross on the 4th of July 1975, and her whereabouts or her body have never been found. So Juanita Nilsson was another beautiful young woman who had accomplished a lot in her life from a very young age. She was a newspaper founder. As we said before, she was a conservation activist. She was also the great-granddaughter of Mark Foy. Nilsson opposed a development on heritage-listed Victoria Street, King's Cross in Sydney, initiated by property developer Frank Thiemann of Victoria Point Proprietary Limited. It is generally believed that she was killed because of her conservationist, and there have been strong suspicions of involvement of organised crime, and you guessed it again, police corruption. And if you'll remember back to the video that I have done on the 1979 ghost train fire that killed 6 people in Sydney, if you haven't watched it yet, I'll drop a link in the description box. You need to watch it. This kind of crosses over a little bit with that, with some of the names that were mentioned then. They were also very active in Sydney at the time Juanita was raising awareness and trying to prevent the demolition of the heritage terrace houses in Victoria Street, one of which that she owned. So this was what basically everybody believes got her killed. But there are going to be some familiar names that are about to come up, and you will notice them if you watch the Sydney Ghost Train fire, that one of these people was always had his nasty little fingers in all of the real estate stuff and takeovers and things going on in Sydney in this era. Where the police corruption comes in is you'll recognise that they used to say, are you in on the joke, with some of the corrupt policemen, and what that used to mean. Not only did we have Roger Rogerson rolling around doing his thing, we also had, and I bet a lot of you have guessed who I'm about to say, Abe Saffron. Yup, his little fingers were in this one too. He was well known for starting fires to get insurance money, roll it over and buy another property that he wanted. He was also known for giving other unscrupulous people loans so they could purchase other land that was valuable around Sydney at this time. So as we said, there had been strong suspicions of involvement with organised crime and police corruption. In the early 1980s, 2 men associated with King's Cross crime boss Abe Saffron were jailed for conspiracy to kidnap Nielsen based on the incidents leading up to her disappearance. A coronial inquest in November 1983 determined that Nielsen had been murdered, but did not identify the place, cause, or the perpetrators. This unsolved case has continued to be a concern for the Australian community and has inspired several films. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Juanita now, because put herself out there at great personal danger. So Nielsen was born Juanita Jones Smith in New Lambton, New South Wales, to Neil Donovan Smith and Vilma Grace Smith. Her parents separated soon after birth, and she was raised by her maternal grandmother at Killara in Sydney. Her father, Neil, was an English-born heir to the Mark Foy's retail fortune via his parents, John Joseph Smith, who was the chairman and managing director of Mark Foy's Limited, and his wife, Kathleen Sophie Foy. Kathleen was a sister of the founder, Mark Foy and Frances Foy. Now, here we go again. I can't believe how many crossovers happen with these cases of people actually kind of being around, like people that I know or people that actually in my family. And this is for Mum. So Mum was a young woman in Sydney at around this time, and she was actually working for Mark Foy's, and they had 2 branches. They had the great big main store there on the main streets of Sydney, and then they had this other lovely little boutique where Mum was working. And it was just like any other little shop you go into now. Like they'd have dresses and I guess whatever here, maybe some shoes here, a few accessories. And Mum actually used to work in the lay-by department of this branch of Mark Foy. And at the same time, Juanita Nielsen was actually working at the big main building, the big department store. That was Mark Foy at the time. Mark Foy has actually been sold on since, and it no longer exists, which I think is a shame, because I would love, if I ever got a chance to go back to Sydney for a trip sometime, to actually go and see the places where Mum used to hang out, where she used to work, and also places that are relevant to the cases that I cover. But sadly, Mark Foy's is now gone, but Mum was actually working there. And I did ask Mum, had she ever seen Juanita? Did she ever bump into her? And she said no, that she'd never seen Juanita. But she did say a friend of hers was actually working at the big Mark Foy's department store, and she was working in like the ladies' accessories and handbags and shoes. And Juanita would have been working quite close to her because Juanita was a glove model. That's what she was working as at Mark Foy's at the time. So I thought that was really interesting. And just getting back just for a moment to the ghost train fire of 1979, a friend of Mum's was actually telling me that she watched it, and her sister was actually on the ghost train ride before it burst into flames. And she went on to say to her sister, if we hadn't gone through when we had, if we'd waited any longer, we would have been in the lot that went through when the fire broke out. So that's pretty scary. So this is like a couple of things that I've actually found people we know, and my own mother was around at the time for. So yeah, it's amazing. Like, this is a huge country, but there's always somebody you know, or somebody knows somebody who was around at that time that remembers these things, or was around at about the time these people would have been alive and just going about their daily lives. And I find that interesting. So Nielsen was educated at various schools, including Ravenswood School for Girls. So she worked, as we said, at Mark Foy's as a glove model, and then she travelled overseas. And in 1962, she was also travelling overseas. At that time, she married a Danish merchant seaman, Jorgen Fritz Nielsen, in Kobe, Japan, but the marriage ended in divorce in 1967. Nielsen returned to Sydney in 1965 after living abroad and ran a fashion boutique, Mark Foy's, for about 5 years. So that would have been around the time that Mum and her friend were working at Foy's. Like I said, Mum was at the little department store further down, and her friend was working in the big department store probably would have been working pretty close to Juanita. So Nielsen's father, in the early 1970s, bought her a home at 202 Victoria Street in the Sydney locality of King's Cross, and a local newspaper called Now. She published Now fortnightly from her home with the assistance of her business partner, David Farrell. Nielsen modelled for fashions and hairstyles for the newspaper. So now we move on to what was so special about the terraced homes in Victoria Street. Frank William Thiemann, an Austrian-Australia developer, formed a property development firm known as Victoria Point Proprietary Limited and planned to redevelop the heritage Victoria Street, King's Cross. 3 45-storey apartment buildings and a 15-storey office block were planned, therefore necessitating the demolition of all the existing buildings, and that was including Juanita's home. The King's Cross community campaigned against the development and successfully lobbied the Builders Labourers Federation, or the BLF, to impose a green ban on the site in 1972. Supported by the BLF, the residents of Victoria Street refused to leave their houses. Nielsen used her newspaper to publicise the issue. As a member of the Victoria Street Ratepayers Association, Nielsen also lodged an objection to the development proposal with the local council. The BLF leader and prominent Communist Party figure, Jack Mundy, described Nielsen as an upper-class person who initially disapproved of unionism, communism and squatting, but she did become more sympathetic to the cause. In 1973, King's Cross resident Arthur King was kidnapped by 2 unidentified men who put him into the boot of their car. King was driven to a motel outside the city and held for 3 days before being released near the Venus Room in King's Cross. King quit as the head of the Residents' Action Group and immediately moved out of the area. Distrustful of the police because of the recent harassment, he did not tell the truth about his disappearance until 1977. There is evidence that the King's Cross nightclub manager James McCartney, Jim Anderson, was involved with the kidnapping. Other residents on Victoria Street were regularly harassed by 3 men employed by Thiemann as he attempted to have them evicted from their houses. They were led by Fred Cray, a former detective sergeant with, you guessed it, the New South Wales Police. Cray was reputed to be involved in organised crime, and he was suspected of murdering prostitute Shirley Briffman after she had accused him of corruption. And yes, I will be doing a video all about Shirley Briffman as well. King's Cross residents would move into each other's houses so that no house was left unattended. In 1973, when merchant seaman, jazz musician and communist activist Jack Rabbold Fowler, commonly known as Mick, returned from a period working at sea, he found that his rented house was boarded up. Repossessing his home, Fowler fought and in 1976 lost a court battle to stay there. The strain of the struggle reputedly led to his early death, aged 51, in August 1979. Residents who had squatted in the houses were evicted by police on January 3, 1974. In 1974, Nielsen stepped up her opposition to the development in her newspaper. The BLF's green ban was broken in late 1974 when the federal leadership of the BLF, bribed by developers, dismissed the leaders of the New South Wales branch. However, the green ban was continued by the Federated Engine Drivers and Firemen's Association. In addition, Nielsen convinced the Waterboard Union to impose their own green ban. In February 1975, Thiemann met with Nielsen to try and unsuccessfully change her mind about the development. By June 1975, interest charges on the money borrowed by Thiemann's company were accruing at a rate of over $16,800 per week. The first stage of the Victoria Street development was completed in 1978. So the Builders and Labourers Federation marched on International Women's Day in Sydney in 1975. In the nearby suburb of Woolloomooloo in 1975, the New South Wales and federal governments reached an agreement with Thiemann for the development of the Woolloomooloo Basin. But here came Juanita again. Nielsen was a member of the Woolloomooloo Residents Action Group, which was receiving threats in 1975. So she was being very instrumental in trying to stop this guy doing what he wanted to do. The Carousel Club in King's Cross, also known as Les Girls in other times, was one of a number of bars and nightclubs controlled by... Let's all say it together because I know you know who I'm going to say. Abe Saffron. And here he comes again. Ugh. The contempt I have for this man, oh my God, it's unparalleled. No, there are more that I probably find in contempt more than him. But he's right up there. He's not even human. He can just be called a creature at best. So Abe Saffron, who, as we all know, is a major figure in the Sydney underground organised crime. The club was managed by Jim Anderson, who, as a later investigation revealed, owed about $260,000, about Australia $16 million in 2011 money, to Thiemann, according to Saffron's son Alan. Saffron lent a large sum of money to several prominent Sydney businessmen, including Thiemann. Once again, I have no words. The Carousel had no dealings with Nielsen previously, but on the 13th of June 1975, Anderson had initiated contact by sending Nielsen an invitation to attend a press night at the club. She would not normally have been invited because her newspaper Now did not give free publicity to commercial ventures. Nielsen did not attend the event, and Anderson was reported to have been absolutely furious. On the 29th of June, the Carousel's PR manager, Lloyd Marshall, invited Nielsen to a meeting at the Camperdown Travelodge, supposedly to discuss advertising related to landscaping. But her partner David Farrell later recounted that Nielsen had become suspicious and she refused to attend. On the 30th of June, Edward Frederick Eddie Trigg and Shane Martin Simmons, both employees at the Carousel, went to Nielsen's house ostensibly to discuss advertising in Now. It was later revealed that they intended to seize Nielsen when she opened the door, but this plan was foiled when Farrell answered the door instead. The two men played out their cover story, but Nielsen was listening in an adjoining room, and after they left, complimented Farrell on his handling of the query, teasing him by saying she might send him out on the road to sell advertising in Now next. According to Farrell, Nielsen was by then seriously concerned about her activism and that it was putting her in danger. She mentioned her fears to Farrell about 2 weeks before her disappearance, as she arranged to keep him regularly informed of her whereabouts. So when she went missing, he pretty much knew straight away that something was terribly wrong. On Thursday, the 3rd of July at 5:30 p.m, Trigg rang Nielsen to make an appointment to discuss the club advertising in Now. They agreed to meet the next day at about 10:15 a.m. at the club. And we've just established that Nielsen was afraid of these guys, that she was in fear probably of her life, that she knew if she was alone with these people, something bad would happen. But I'm wondering why, if she had these suspicions, did she go to the meeting at the club? Whether she felt safe because it was at 10:15 a.m. and it was broad daylight and there'd be many other people around. I have no idea what Juanita Nielsen was thinking, but I'm sure as her friend and her family and her other friends apart from Farrell and other people who loved Juanita, and she was loved. She was respected. She was loved. She was an heiress, but she hadn't let it go to her head. She was out there campaigning to stop these beautiful heritage-listed buildings being demolished and, just years of family memories being destroyed. And that's what she was campaigning for. And, as we know, a great personal risk to herself. So who knows what she was thinking the day she decided that, yes, she would meet these men at the club. So on Friday, the 4th of July 1975, Nielsen went to the Carousel Club in King's Cross for the meeting with Trigg about the advertising as had been arranged the previous night. At 10:30 a.m., she telephoned Farrell to tell him she was running late for the meeting. Jump forward to the year 2000. Loretta Crawford, the receptionist at the Carousel, made a new claim that she made a phone call to Jim Anderson at his home in... Sorry, this is not funny at all, but... along comes the name of this suburb again that I was informed by my lovely mum that I said wrong before. And it was actually, so this all keeps crossing over. It's very weird. That was the suburb that the 4 boys from Waverley College that attended the Ghost Train fire, in which 4 of them died. Actually, it was 5 boys. 4 of them died. They were from Vaucluse. I said it wrong before. I think I called it Vauclore or something like that because I wasn't sure of the pronunciation, but it's Vaucluse. So she made a phone call to Jim Anderson at his home in Vaucluse that told him that Nielsen had arrived and that he was quite pleased by the news. Crawford was adamant that Anderson was at his home in Vaucluse, not in Surfers Paradise, Queensland, as he had always claimed. In original statements given to the police, Trigg and Crawford claimed that after the meeting, Nielsen left the club alone, although in 1976 Crawford changed his story to say that Nielsen and Trigg left together. A local real estate agent told police that he saw Nielsen getting into a yellow car outside the club. There were 2 men in the car with her. And unfortunately, this was the last known sighting of Juanita Nielsen. On Saturday, Farrell reported Nielsen to the police as a missing person. When Trigg was questioned by the police, he confirmed the meeting and produced a receipt. Nielsen had given him for an advance payment on the advertising. He then said that she had left the establishment to attend a lunch appointment. Nielsen's handbag and other effects were discovered on the 7th of July, abandoned on a freeway near Penrith in Sydney's west. On Tuesday, 8th of July, the police released the news of the disappearance to the media. So there has been a memorial constructed for Juanita Nielsen at the South Head Cemetery, Vaucluse, New South Wales. In late 1977, Trigg, Shane Martin Simmons and Lloyd Marshall, all one-time employees of the Carousel Club, were charged with conspiring to kidnap Nielsen over the incidents prior to her disappearance. When interviewed by police on the 6th of November 1977, Martin Simmons confirmed that the advertising story was a ruse and that the actual intention was to kidnap Nielsen if she was alone and take her to see people who wanted to talk to her. I bet they did. He said that he and Trigg attended to, and this is in her words, just grab her arms and stop her calling out, no real rough stuff, no gangster stuff. We thought that just 2 guys telling her to come would be enough to make her think if she didn't come, she might get hurt. We talked about when she came into the room, one of us would be standing there and the other one would come up behind her and just quietly grab her by the arms and maybe put a hand over her mouth or perhaps a pillow slip over her head. How lovely. Martin Simmons told police he didn't know the identity of the people who wanted to talk to Nielsen. I'm sure he didn't. A trial commenced in 1980. The judge ordered the jury to acquit Marshall as there is no evidence linking him to the plan to use force against Nielsen. The jury was unable to reach a verdict on Trigg and Martin Simmons, and a retrial was ordered. Martin Simmons was retried, convicted, and sentenced to just 2 years jail. The judge questioned him about the identity of the people who had hired him for the kidnapping, but he would provide no further information. Trigg had fled to the US on a fake passport and was arrested in San Francisco in 1982. He told police they're making all this noise over a woman, oh my God, who, now these are his words again, so please don't come for me. How did these, honestly though, it staggers me. Now I've done so many of these videos with you guys, but How did these people exist? How? How do people like this exist? I mean, yeah, I know all about psychology, blah, blah. I have studied a lot, but oh my God, I can't believe he said this about her, but obviously the guy was I'm not going to say it here on YouTube, but you know what I'm thinking. He told police, they're making all this noise over a woman who was nothing but an out-and-out communist. No loss to society at all. Extradited back to Australia, he pleaded guilty and in 1983 was imprisoned for just 3 years. Again, I have no words. I say that a lot, but I get absolutely stumped by some of this. A coronial inquest with a jury was held in 1983, and it was the longest in New South Wales history at this time, running for 13 weeks and hearing from 69 witnesses. Thiemann denied that Nielsen was a threat to his development plans. Saffron said that he had heard of the disappearance in the newspapers, but hadn't inquired further. I suppose he wouldn't have to, he knew what happened. The inquest heard that Anderson had numerous personal and business links with the Thiemann family. Anderson agreed he was an obvious suspect, but denied any involvement, directly or indirectly. The counsel assisting him in the inquest described him as a stranger to the truth. Anderson blamed Detective Fred Cray for Nielsen's death. Counsel for the Nielsen estate said that Trigg and Martin Simmons had been involved in the disappearance, arguing that having two groups plotting against Nielsen at the same time would be a very, very unbelievable coincidence. However, neither the coroner nor any counsel appearing at the inquest argued that there was enough evidence to make a case against any one known person. The jury determined that Nielsen had died on or shortly after the 4th of July 1975, although there was not enough evidence to show how she had died or who may have been responsible. The jury found there was evidence to show that the police inquiries were inhibited by an atmosphere of corruption, real or imagined, that did exist at the time. So this was then followed by a federal parliamentary committee. And in 1994, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Joint Committee on the National Crime Authority criticised police failings and linked the Nielsen disappearance to property developers and the King's Cross criminal underworld. The committee questioned the National Crime Authority's use of Jim Anderson as a protected informer, as he was a suspect in the disappearance and other criminal activities. So, as always, there were subsequent media claims still surrounding Juanita's disappearance. A New Zealand-born woman, Marilyn King, the former girlfriend of Eddie Trigg, told one journalist that Trigg had returned home on July 4 with blood on his clothes, a piece of paper in his pocket that also had a smear of blood on it. This was supposedly a receipt signed by Nielsen for the advertising money paid by Trigg. King said that Trigg threw out the shirt and the portion of the paper with the blood on it. King never gave testimony to the police or the coronial inquiry. However, one of the documentaries that I watched, and it is amazing, Crime Investigation Australia, he does, now I'm saying he, this is going to get confusing, he is actually identifies as transgender, and I believe back in the day he was working as one of the lay girls, and he was one of these people. He was actually very attractive. He made a very pretty woman, and he was in a relationship with Eddie Trigg, but he does identify as female. But when he appears on Crime Investigation Australia, he does appear just as himself, and he pretty much tells it all. And I'm going to be linking the videos that I've watched for this in the description box below, so that you can go and watch their reporting on this issue, because we don't want these girls to be forgotten about, either one of them. The personal sacrifice, and I know I kept going back to this, that they both knew that they were in grave danger, but they kept on, and that's just bravery, honestly, and just putting themselves last. I think that's why it hits me in the feels so much about these women. And they were both so young when they died. So in 2004, ABC TV's The 7:30 Report broadcast a new interview with Crawford in which she claimed her previous testimony regarding Nielsen was false and had been concocted to protect her former boss, James Anderson, but that Anderson's recent death meant she was now free to reveal the truth. Crawford's new claim was that Nielsen had indeed been killed in the basement of the club in the presence of Trigg and Martin Simmons, and that she had seen Nielsen's body on the floor, bearing a single small gunshot wound, and that she saw a third man whom she did not name standing over Nielsen's body holding a pistol. The obvious motive for Nielsen's murder was her opposition to the Victoria Street development. However, there have also been claims that she was working on an expose about vice, corruption and illegal gambling in La Crosse. Her then-boyfriend, John Glebe, gave evidence that Nielsen had told him about receiving telephone threats, and he also testified that she carried cassette tapes in her handbag. According to Glebe, Nielsen had told him that the tapes could blow the top off, an issue that she was working on. An article in the Bulletin in 2005 ran claims by journalist Barry Ward that Nielsen had been given dossiers on prominent Sydney identities by private detective Alan Honeysett, and speculated that these documents would reputedly have exposed the principals involved in Sydney's illegal gaming industry. So you can imagine she was in a lot of danger. In 2013, the Australian newspaper reported that prior to his death, Trigg had written an account of his involvement in the case, which named names of those involved and revealed the resting place of Nielsen's remains. New South Wales police spokesman confirmed that police had searched Trigg's residence after his death, but they refused to comment on the outcome. The report also said the account was to be published after his death to provide an inheritance for his descendants. How lovely of him. I'm going to write about how we killed someone so that I can get money for my family when I die. Just wow. In 2021, the reward for information on the disappearance of Juanita Nielsen was doubled to $1 million. Her family and the police expressed a hope that they might be able to find Juanita's remains. So, many documentaries and films have been made about Juanita Nielsen. Her disappearance was fictionalised in Donald Crombie's The Killing of Angel Street in 1981. Crombie said making the film was fraught with tension. We researched it pretty thoroughly and we got fairly close to the beast, I think. It would go on to say that they were particularly warned off by none other a person than John Dowd, who is now a judge. He went on to say he believed he was now a judge. He rang Tony Buckley and said that this film was a bit too close to the bone. Talking about me, he said. He's got young children and he should be thinking a bit about what he's doing. It didn't put us off, but you did look under the car for about 2 days afterwards because you thought, hang on a minute, what's this all about? And the nexus between the government, big business and crime. They're very comfortable together, he would say. This was swiftly followed by another movie, Philip Noyce's Heat Wave in 1982, an artistic documentary. Zanny Begs the Beehive came out in 2018. The City of Sydney Council opened the Juanita Nielsen Community Centre in Woolloomooloo in 1983. And that brings us to the end of today's video and the sad and tragically short lives of two of Australia's most courageous women, Sallie Ann Huckstepp, the whistleblower, and Juanita Nielsen, the heiress. So while never definitively proven, Sallie Ann was believed to have been murdered by Arthur Nettie Smith at the behest of Roger Rogerson. And at least her remains were found and laid to rest. Juanita Nielsen has never been found. Her family have never been able to put Juanita to rest as she deserves to be. If anyone anywhere has any information on the whereabouts of Juanita Nielsen, even after all these years, please call Crime Stoppers on 1800 333 000, and as always, you may remain anonymous. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on today's cases. Did you live in Sydney around these times? Do you remember Sally or Juanita? Or do you remember seeing these stories on the news? I would love to hear your thoughts, but as always, please keep your comments respectful. And also, guys, please remember that I'm not making these stories up out of my head. I'm also not responsible for what happens to the perpetrators of, going to jail and stuff. Please just remember that when you're commenting on these things. I'm just telling the story of these people because we can't forget what Roger Rogerson did, what Abe Saffron did, what the owners of these nightclubs were doing, and how these courageous women were trying to stop all this. That's why I do these videos. I don't want these people to be forgotten. So just keep that in mind when you're commenting. I'm merely reporting on cases and telling a story. And I get all of my information, like we all do, from podcasts, from documentaries, and from reading about them on the internet. That's where I get all of my information from. I don't make anything up, and I don't try to sensationalise anything. So just please keep that in mind and keep your comments respectful. And please keep your comments respectful towards the people in the video as well, if you can, because it just keeps YouTube a nicer place for us all if we're respecting each other. So in case you were wondering, Juanita's home in Victoria Street still stands as a lasting monument to her, but it has been earmarked for heritage listing. But in an eerie twist of fate, the site has come up again for redevelopment, which I really hope doesn't happen. It would be nice to think that Juanita's little house will always be there and help to stop her and her legacy being forgotten. And also the legacies of everybody else who was rallying to save Victoria Street and the beautiful heritage terraced homes that still stand there. Because there were other people who were trying to stop this as well, and who put a lot of hard work in and who did not want to see their homes demolished. And, they probably still have family members living there, or at least have family who would like to visit the homes of their relatives that they used to live in back then. So I'm really hoping that these developments don't happen. So if I get any more, as always, any more updates or anything surrounding this case or the development, I will let you guys know in a future video. So as always, thank you all so much for watching. I love you all dearly, and I appreciate you all so much for sticking with me and watching my videos. And stay safe, and I will see you all in my next video. And if you're in Australia right now, keep warm because it is freezing. And I'm going to go and get myself another cup of coffee. Oh, it's so cold. I'm actually laughing about it because usually it was like, oh, we had winter. When did that happen? But this year it is actually really cold. And we're having a big snow dump at the moment in all the alpine regions. And one of the alpine regions, it's a small one, but Glen Innes is only up the road from me. It's just up the road from where we filmed at Ramornie the other weekend. And all the cold air is coming down. So that's why I'm rugged up like an Eskimo on most of the videos now, because we live in an old farmhouse and it gets very drafty. But I do love it. Anyway, stay warm, stay safe, and don't be around people you don't know. Don't accept lifts with strangers. And I will see you all in my next video. Bye.